My son stood in my kitchen, the one I had painted yellow with Harold 30 years ago, and told me I was moving to a nursing home and that he was selling my house. Just like that. No question, no conversation. A decision handed down like a verdict. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The truth hit me in a way I can only describe as a full-body cold, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads to your fingertips. But do you know what I did? I smiled. I nodded. I said, "Okay, Derek." And I meant none of it. What he didn't know, what neither he nor his wife could have imagined, was that behind that quiet smile, something was already awake. Something patient and precise. He had cheated me out of the future he thought he'd secured, lied to real estate professionals, and implied I was too fragile to understand what was happening. He had humiliated the woman who raised him in the most private, intimate way a person can be shamed. He thought he was solving a problem. He had no idea he had just started a war, and he had no idea which one of us was actually ready for it. For 2 weeks, he and Renee celebrated. They talked about timelines and market value and logistics. They sent me brochures with cheerful fonts and outdoor terraces. And I read them. I nodded. I said the right things. I was the cooperative, compliant mother they needed me to be. While quietly, in a library, in an attorney's office, in signed and notarized documents, I was building something they would not see coming until the day the buyers showed up to close, and discovered that the house they thought was being sold had already been placed beyond Derek's reach. What happened next changed everything, and I want to tell you exactly how I did it. His name is Derek, my only son, the boy I raised with Harold, the man I loved for over 4 decades. And there he was, sitting in my living room with that practiced calm, like he'd rehearsed it in the car. Betrayal doesn't always come with venom and shouting. Sometimes it wears a blazer and speaks in measured sentences. Sometimes it looks exactly like your child. He brought his wife Renee with him, and she sat there nodding like a cosigner on a death sentence. They talked about logistics, transitions, what's best for me. But not once, did either of them ask how I felt. The truth was written all over their faces. This wasn't about love or concern. This was about the house. This was about the money. And they thought I was too old and too tired to see it. I nodded. I said, "I understand." I even poured them coffee. And the whole time, while they spoke and smiled and planned, my mind was already moving in a completely different direction. I've survived grief. I've survived loss. I've survived 67 years of life that carved me into something much tougher than they gave me credit for. Payback doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes disguised as compliance. They left that afternoon believing they had won. Derek kissed my cheek at the door. He said, "We'll figure out the timeline soon, Mom." I smiled back. I waved goodbye. And then I closed the door, sat back down at my kitchen table, and started to think. Not with panic, not with tears, with absolute, crystal-clear purpose. Because if my son truly believed I would hand over everything without a fight, he was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Somewhere under all that calm, the very first pieces of a plan were already falling quietly into place, and neither Derek nor Renee had any idea the clock had already started. That house on Elm Crest Drive isn't just a property. It's where Harold and I built everything, piece by piece, year by year, with our own hands and our own savings and our own stubborn, relentless love. I remember the day we moved in, 2 young people with almost nothing and a belief that what we were building together would last. And it did. 41 years of it. 41 years that no deed or title can begin to capture. The walls of that house hold more than insulation. They hold us. The kitchen was Harold's favorite room. He painted it yellow. That warm, ridiculous, beautiful yellow that I complained about for 3 weeks, and then secretly loved for the next 4 decades. I can still see him standing at that stove on Sunday mornings, humming something off-key and burning toast without a care in the world. Family betrayal hits different when the thing being taken isn't just square footage. When they decided to sell my house, they decided to erase Harold. And that I could not allow. I planted those rose bushes in the front garden the spring after we lost our first pregnancy. Harold held my hand in the dirt and said, "Let's grow something beautiful anyway." So we did. Every year after that, they bloomed. A quiet little act of defiance against heartbreak, a reminder that beauty can survive pain. When I stood at the window and watched Derek walk across that garden without a second glance, I felt something twist in my chest that wasn't grief. It was recognition. He'd been cheated out of knowing what this place really meant. The truth is, I never thought I'd need to defend my own home. I never imagined that the person I'd need to defend it from would be someone who once took his first steps in the hallway right by the front door. Humiliated doesn't even begin to cover how it felt. I was shamed in the most private of ways, not in public, not by a stranger, but by someone who carried my last name. Someone I had poured my entire self into raising. The betrayal of it was almost surreal. But here's what Derek didn't understand. This house wasn't just my past. It was my spine. It was the place that had held me upright through every hard season of my life. And I'll tell you something. You don't let someone take your spine without a fight. Not at 67. Not ever. I walked through every room that night, running my fingers along the walls, and I made a silent promise to Harold and to myself. Nobody was going to sell our life. Nobody. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew I wasn't going to fight with emotion. I was going to fight with something far more powerful. There's a moment, a very specific, very quiet moment, when you stop feeling hurt and start feeling clear. For me, it came a few days after that first visit, when Derek and Renee showed up again, this time with printed brochures of nursing facilities and a yellow notepad full of bullet points. They sat at my dining table and talked about options and timelines and market value, like I wasn't sitting right across from them, like I was already gone. And that's when I understood they weren't worried about me. They were worried about the asset. I watched Renee flip through the brochures with the efficiency of someone shopping for appliances. She highlighted one page, dog-eared another, and said to Derek, not to me, to Derek, "This one has good reviews and it's close enough for visits." Close enough for visits. I had given birth to this man. I had held him through nightmares and fevers and heartbreaks. And now I was a logistical consideration to be placed conveniently within visiting distance. The family drama unfolding in my dining room was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The backstabbing wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came in spreadsheets and highlighted brochures and quiet conversations they thought I wasn't fully understanding. That's the cruelest kind of betrayal. The one that treats you as already diminished, already incapable, already irrelevant. They had lied, in the most fundamental sense of the word. Not with false statements, but with the story they were telling themselves about who I was and what I deserved. I could see it plainly now. I kept my expression neutral. I asked mild questions. I let them talk. And the whole time, behind my calm eyes, I was cataloging every single detail. Who said what papers they'd brought, what assumptions they were making. Because I had learned something important in 67 years. The people who underestimate you are always the ones who hand you the most power. They couldn't see what I was doing, because they couldn't imagine I was doing anything at all. That was their first mistake. Dignity, I've learned, isn't something other people give you. It's something you choose to carry even when they're doing everything they can to strip it away. Derek and Renee thought they were managing a problem. They had absolutely no idea they were activating a solution. And sitting there that afternoon, nodding and sipping my tea while they color-coded my future, I was already thinking about my next move. The kind of move you only make once. The kind you make right. There was one person I needed to talk to, and I already had her name written on a small piece of paper tucked in the back of my address book. The next morning, I went to the public library right when it opened. Not because I didn't have internet. I have internet. But because the library felt right. It felt like a place where information was still a weapon that belonged to everyone, not just to people with money and lawyers on speed dial. I sat at a table near the window and started reading everything I could find about property law, elder rights, and what exactly a son can and cannot do to his mother's home. And with every page, I felt something unexpected. I felt power returning to me. The research was dense, but I was patient. I took notes in a small green notebook I'd bought at the gift shop on my way in. I wrote down phrases like living trust, power of attorney limitations, elder financial abuse, and title protection. I didn't understand all of it at first, but I kept going because the truth was there, waiting for me in black and white, and I was not going to let a lack of legal vocabulary stand between me and my home. Vengeance, real vengeance, starts in the quiet places, in libraries, in notebooks, in the hours before anyone else is awake. By my third visit, within a week, I had a name, Patricia Owens, a real estate and elder law attorney who had been recommended twice in the community forums I'd been quietly reading. She had a small office on Birchwood Avenue, and her reviews mentioned words that mattered to me. Words like patient, thorough, and she fights for her clients. I wrote down her number, closed my notebook, and called her from my cell phone the moment I stepped outside. But I smiled while I did it. I had told no one. Not Barbara, my closest friend. Not my neighbor. Not a single soul. Because the moment you tell someone your plan, it stops being entirely yours. And I needed this to be entirely mine. Infidelity to trust comes in many forms. And Derek had shown me that even blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. So I was learning to be strategic in a way I had never needed to be before. I was learning to keep my cards so close that even the people who loved me couldn't accidentally reveal them. Self-worth, real self-worth, is not something that shouts. It doesn't announce itself. It sits down at a library table and it does the work. It makes the phone call. It walks into the attorney's office without trembling and says, I need to protect what's mine. That's what I did. Quietly, methodically, without drama. And the moment Patricia Owens shook my hand and said, Tell me everything, I knew I had found exactly the right person for what was coming. What she found when she started pulling on the legal threads of my situation was something that turned my quiet resolve into something far more certain and far more serious than I had originally imagined. Patricia didn't waste a single second of my time. From the moment I sat down across from her desk and explained what Derek had done, she listened with the focused intensity of someone who had seen this exact scenario before and who knew precisely what to do about it. She confirmed what I had suspected after my library sessions. Derek had zero legal authority over my property. None. No power of attorney, no guardianship, no co-ownership. My house was mine, and he had been operating on the assumption that I was either too confused or too defeated to know that. He was wrong on both counts. But Patricia didn't stop at reassurance. She said something that shifted everything for me. Eleanor, knowing you're protected isn't the same as being protected. Let's make sure they can't even open the door to this fight. And so we got to work. She explained the Eleanor Sims Living Trust, a legal structure that would transfer the home out of my individual estate entirely, making any unauthorized sale legally impossible. It was elegant. It was airtight. And it was exactly the kind of chess move that someone like Derek would never see coming from someone like me. Justice, real justice, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a stack of legal documents signed in a quiet office on a Thursday afternoon, while your son thinks you're still sitting at home watching television and slowly accepting your fate. That's what I was doing while Derek and Renee were planning their timeline. I was not passive. I was not scared. I was preparing. And Patricia was the most valuable ally I had ever had in my 67 years of life. She didn't just know the law, she understood what it felt like to have it weaponized against you. She had seen it too many times. Within 2 weeks, Patricia had drafted the trust documents, arranged a title search to confirm the property's clean legal status, and created a series of legal safeguards that would block any attempt to sell, mortgage, or transfer my property without my explicit, documented, witnessed consent. She also briefed me on what to watch for: any new approaches from Derek, any papers he might try to sneak in front of me, any attempts to escalate through the courts. I felt, for the first time since that afternoon in my kitchen, like I wasn't fighting alone. The karma of careful preparation was already beginning its quiet work. I left Patricia's office that evening with a folder of documents and a feeling I hadn't experienced in weeks. Calm. Not the fragile, pretended calm of someone trying not to break down. The deep, earned calm of someone who knows exactly what's coming and has already prepared the response. I drove home, made myself dinner, and sat at Harold's yellow kitchen table with a cup of tea. And I thought, let Derek believe what he wants to believe. Let him make his plans. Let him think I've folded. Because while he was celebrating, Patricia was already setting the trap, and the most shocking part was still a few weeks away. And then, while the trust was being finalized, Patricia's office began making discreet inquiries, and what they uncovered proved beyond any doubt that my son had never intended to ask for my permission at all. Patricia called me on a Friday morning, and I could tell by the measured steadiness of her voice that what she'd found was serious. She told me to come in. When I sat down and she laid the findings in front of me, the words on the page felt like ice water. During her diligence, one of the real estate agencies had confirmed that Derek had already contacted them, not as the son of the homeowner, but as the estate representative, as if I were already dead, or already incapacitated, or already irrelevant to the transaction he was engineering around me. I sat very still. I read the details, I looked at the dates, and I felt the full, undeniable weight of what this meant. My son hadn't just floated a cruel idea over coffee. He had already set the wheels in motion. He had already started building the infrastructure of my removal. He had lied, not just to me, but to licensed real estate professionals who now had documentation of his misrepresentation. The truth was no longer something I sensed or feared. The truth was documented, black and white, time-stamped. The backstabbing had a paper trail, and that changed everything. Up until that moment, there was still a small part of me, the mother part, the part that remembers a boy learning to ride a bike and crying when he scraped his palms, that wanted to believe maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe it was just clumsy love. Maybe he genuinely thought it was best. But you don't call yourself the estate representative of someone who is still alive, still lucid, and still sitting in her own kitchen, unless you have already written her off entirely. I had been cheated in the most fundamental way a parent can be cheated by a child. Patricia explained that these communications could constitute elder financial exploitation under state law, which meant that the legal ground beneath Derek's feet was far more unstable than he realized. She was documenting everything, every agency contact, every misrepresentation. The case against his claim wasn't just solid, it was building. And the most powerful part? He didn't know we knew. He was still out there, contacting buyers, moving his timeline forward, convinced he was 2 steps ahead. He had no idea I had already lapped him. Humiliated is a word I've been reluctant to claim as my own throughout all of this. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt shamed on behalf of the woman I thought my son knew. Because the woman he described to those real estate agents, passive, dependent, manageable, was not me. It had never been me. And now, with every page of those findings, the real picture of who I was and who he had become was becoming undeniable. I had raised him better than this, and the grief of that was something I would have to carry quietly. But for now, I had something more important to do than grieve. I had a plan to protect, a trust to finalize, and a son who was still completely unaware that the woman he had underestimated was about to show him exactly what 67 years of quiet strength actually looks like. Here's the thing about revenge that no one tells you. The most powerful version of it requires you to smile. It requires you to answer the phone warmly, to say, "Of course, honey," when every cell in your body wants to say something else entirely. It requires a kind of self-mastery that isn't comfortable, but it works. And so I kept playing my part. When Derek called to talk timelines, I was cooperative. When Renee texted asking which furniture pieces I wanted to keep, I sent thoughtful replies. I was giving them exactly what they needed to believe I had surrendered, and I had never been further from surrendering in my life. Patricia had advised me to maintain the appearance of compliance for a very specific reason. If Derek sensed resistance, he might accelerate his timeline or attempt to involve the courts prematurely. Our window of time was precious. We needed the trust finalized and recorded before he had any reason to look more closely. So I became an actress of the quietest kind. Every pleasant conversation with Derek was a performance designed to buy us another day. I smiled, and I stalled, and I signed the documents Patricia needed, the right ones, and I handed over nothing that mattered. Infidelity to a relationship isn't always romantic. Sometimes it's the kind a child commits against a parent when they decide, unilaterally, that her life no longer belongs to her. And Derek had committed that kind of betrayal without hesitation. But here's what I had learned by then. Payback doesn't have to be noisy to be total. It doesn't require an argument or an accusation or a dramatic confrontation at the dinner table. It just requires patience, precision, and the right attorney finalizing the right paperwork on the right timeline. Vengeance, when done correctly, looks a lot like stillness. The trust was signed and notarized on a Wednesday morning. The Eleanor Sims Living Trust, recorded with the county clerk, title updated accordingly. Patricia called me that afternoon and said, "It's done, Eleanor. The house is protected." I was standing in my rose garden when she said it, and I looked down at the blooms Harold and I had planted together, and I cried for about 30 seconds. Not from sadness, from something that doesn't have a clean name, something between relief and grief and triumph and gratitude all pressing against each other at once. Then I wiped my face, went back inside, and answered Renee's latest text about paint colors, cheerfully. The reclaiming had already happened. They just didn't know it yet. Derek was still planning his sale, still contacting buyers, still building his timeline. And now, every step he took was a step toward a wall he couldn't see. The most satisfying part of this whole strategy was the simplicity of it. I didn't need him to fail. I just needed him to keep going. Keep believing, keep showing up. Because when the moment of truth finally arrived, the only thing I needed to do was let Patricia open her folder and watch everything Derek thought he controlled disappear in front of him. But before that day came, something unexpected happened. Something that made me realize the situation was even more dangerous than I had thought. After the trust was recorded, Derek began to sense that something had shifted. And that's when the tone of everything changed. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just came over one evening with Renee, sat across from me with that same practiced calmness, and said, very gently, "Mom, we're worried that you're not thinking clearly about this." And then Renee said, "It might be time to have a doctor assess whether you're still able to make these kinds of decisions on your own." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The threat was elegant in its cruelty, not an accusation, but a flag planted so softly it could be dismissed as concern if challenged. I'd done enough research by then to recognize exactly what was happening. They were preparing to challenge my mental capacity. If they could get a court to question my competence, they could potentially bypass every legal safeguard we'd built. They were willing to weaponize my age. That was the moment I understood this was no longer just greed. This was war. Shamed doesn't cover it. Sitting across from my own child while he implied, gently, plausibly, with his wife nodding softly beside him. That I might be losing my mind was one of the most profound humiliations of my life. Family drama doesn't get crueler than that. It just doesn't. I waited until they left. Then I called Patricia and told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good. This actually helps us. Because a competency challenge requires a legal process, which means documentation, timelines, hearings, and documentation cuts both ways." Patricia immediately began preparing a counter-strategy, a formal psychiatric evaluation, an elder rights advocacy group, witness statements, and a complete paper trail of my rational, methodical, legally sound decision-making over the past several weeks. They wanted to question my mind? Fine. We would have it certified. Karma has a sense of timing that is almost poetic. Every move Derek made to tighten his grip was actually loosening it. Every escalation he tried gave us more material, more documentation, more proof of intent. He thought he was playing three-dimensional chess. He was walking into a room full of mirrors. And I kept my voice calm every time I spoke to him after that. Warm, even, unbothered. Because the most powerful thing I could do in that moment was give him absolutely no reason to believe his strategy was working. It wasn't. The next steps would require me to build something I hadn't fully considered yet. A team. Not just Patricia. Not just legal protection. Something broader, more human, more unassailable. And it was already waiting for me, in the form of people who loved me and believed in me and would stand in a room and say so, clearly, under oath if necessary. I had kept this to myself for so long that telling Barbara felt almost physical, like releasing a breath I'd been holding for weeks. She came over on a Sunday afternoon, sat in my kitchen with her tea, and listened to everything. And when I finished, she didn't offer me sympathy, which I loved her for. She offered me something better. She said, "Tell me what you need." That's the thing about people who have truly earned the right to be called your friend. They don't make your crisis about their feelings. They show up and they ask what they can do. Barbara had a connection through her church network to an elder rights advocacy organization called Shield and Dignity, a group of volunteers and legal advocates who had worked with dozens of families in situations exactly like mine. Within 3 days of me making the call, I had a case advisor named Sylvia who had seen competency threats used as elder abuse tactics more times than she could count. She immediately began helping Patricia build a supplemental record of my autonomy, documented instances of my clear, independent, fully informed decision-making. Every library visit, every consultation, every note in my green notebook. It was all evidence of someone who was anything but confused. And then there was Dr. James Whitfield, a geriatric psychiatrist with nearly 30 years of clinical experience, recommended by Patricia and endorsed by Sylvia. He met with me twice, once for a formal cognitive evaluation and once for a longer clinical interview. When his written assessment arrived, it used language that was almost satisfying to read. Fully competent, no signs of diminished capacity, demonstrates sophisticated strategic reasoning, capable of independent decision-making at a high level. Derek had wanted to use a doctor to take me apart. Instead, a doctor had just put everything back together, in writing, with credentials, and with a signature that would hold up in any court in the country. I think about self-worth a lot during this chapter of the story, because this was the moment it stopped being theoretical. Self-worth isn't what you feel in a vacuum. It's what you fight for when someone tries to reduce you. It's the decision to call an attorney when you could just cry. It's the decision to see a psychiatrist not because you're broken, but because you want your wholeness documented and defended. Every resource I was building wasn't just protection, it was a declaration. I am here. I am real. I am not a problem to be managed. And I will prove it in whatever language this situation requires. By the time Patricia scheduled the closing meeting, I had behind me a notarized recorded living trust, a certified psychiatric evaluation, an elder rights advocacy file, a documented paper trail of Derek's misrepresentations, and Barbara, who had offered to be present for any meeting I needed a witness for. I wasn't a frightened old woman hoping her son would have a change of heart. I was a fully prepared, legally protected individual with an airtight case and an attorney who was very, very good at what she did. And the closing meeting was coming. Derek had set the date himself, completely confident that the sale would close without complication. He had no idea that every person he'd invited to that room was about to watch his plan fall apart in real time. The morning of the closing, I dressed carefully. Nothing dramatic, just my good navy blazer, the one Harold always said made me look like I meant business. I arrived at Patricia's office 20 minutes early, and we sat together quietly going over the plan one final time, though there was nothing left to review. Everything was in order. Everything had been in order for weeks. I was calm in a way that surprised even me. Not the fragile stillness of someone holding themselves together, but the kind of peace that comes from being completely prepared for something you've been building toward for a very long time. Derek arrived with Renee and their real estate attorney, a man named Collins, who had apparently been handling the deal on their side with full confidence it was legitimate. He had proceeded because Derek told him the estate paperwork would be formalized at closing, a common enough claim that Collins had accepted without deeper scrutiny. The buyers came in shortly after, a young couple, excited, clutching their mortgage approval letters. Everyone settled around the conference table like this was going to be a routine transaction. Derek barely glanced at me. He had the easy, loose confidence of someone who believes they've already won. Patricia opened her folder. She spoke calmly, precisely, with the measured authority of someone who has done this many times before. She explained that the property at Elmcrest Drive had been placed into the Eleanor Sims Living Trust 6 weeks prior, recorded with the county clerk, title updated accordingly. The house could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the trustee's explicit, documented consent. The trustee was me, and I had not consented. There was, therefore, no sale to close. The room went quiet in a way that I will never forget. It was the specific silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. Collins looked at Derek. Derek looked at the papers. Renee's face did something complicated that I couldn't fully decode. Somewhere between shock and embarrassment and a flash of fury she quickly suppressed. The young buyers looked at each other with the bewildered expression of people who had shown up for a celebration and walked into something else entirely. The justice of the moment was absolutely clean. Derek tried to speak. He said something about miscommunication and needing to sort this out, and looked at Collins as if Collins might somehow fix it. But Collins had already understood that his client had presented him with a fraudulent transaction, that Derek had approached real estate professionals claiming authority he did not have, and had nearly closed a sale on property he had no legal right to sell. Collins began gathering his papers with the calm efficiency of a man distancing himself from a liability. The buyers left with their mortgage approval letters untouched, the room emptied, and Derek was left sitting at that conference table with the full, terrible weight of what had just happened settling onto his shoulders. The shocking thing wasn't the reversal itself. The shocking thing was how completely ordinary it looked from the outside. Just a few documents, a few measured sentences, a woman in a navy blazer sitting at a table. That's all it took to dismantle months of planning and presumption. Because the truth, when it's been properly documented and legally recorded, doesn't need drama. It just needs to be read aloud. What I remember most about the moments after the buyers left is the quality of the silence. Derek sat across from me, and for the first time in months, he had nothing to say. No script, no measured sentences, no Renee leaning in with supportive nods. Just him, and the papers in front of Patricia, and the absolute wreckage of a plan that had never deserved to succeed. I looked at my son and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter, something that felt, in the strangest way, like grief. Collins left first. He said very little, a few professional courtesies, and then he was gone. The aftermath for Derek and Collins was not going to be pleasant. In the days that followed, Derek would learn the full weight of what his misrepresentation exposed him to. Potential elder financial exploitation charges, professional liability for anyone who had acted on his false claims, and the reputational damage of having his scheme witnessed and documented by every person in that room. The payback of consequence is often most felt not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of what you can no longer escape. Derek looked at me and finally said, "How long?" I told him, "From the beginning. From the very first conversation at my kitchen table." He absorbed that for a moment, and I watched something cross his face. Not just embarrassment, but the specific humiliation of realizing that the person he'd been underestimating had been, the entire time, 10 steps ahead of him. He had been cheated out of the outcome he'd expected by his own assumptions. He had lied to real estate professionals, implied I lacked capacity, organized a sale of property he didn't own. And none of it had worked. Not one move. Because I had been building the counter-move from day one. Renee was the first to stand up to leave. She touched Derek's arm quietly, and I noticed for the first time that she looked less like an active co-conspirator and more like someone who hadn't fully grasped the legal seriousness of what Derek had set in motion. A woman who had gone along with a plan she now understood was far more exposed than she'd imagined. The family betrayal that had felt so clinical and confident just weeks ago now had a different texture. Visible, documented, witnessed. The backstabbing had a face now, and everyone in that room had seen it. I stood up. I thanked Patricia. I gathered my bag. And before I walked out, I looked at Derek one final time and said something I had thought about for a long time. I said, "I love you. I always will. But I know what you tried to do." Then I walked out of that conference room, stepped into the afternoon sun, and felt the air on my face like a first breath after a long time underwater. The vengeance wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply undeniable. And it was finished. But walking away from that table didn't mean I was finished deciding what came next. There was still the matter of my home, my healing, and what the rest of my life was going to look like now that I had taken it back. The first thing I did when I got home that evening was open every window in the house. I don't fully know why. Maybe to let the old air out, or to prove to myself that I could do it without asking anyone's permission. It was my house, my windows, my decision to throw them wide open at 5:30 in the evening and let the October breeze move through every room like it owned the place. And then I sat in Harold's yellow kitchen, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I was just home. Reclaiming isn't a single dramatic moment. It's 100 small ones. It's repainting the bedroom yourself instead of asking a son who no longer deserves the invitation. It's buying new seed packets at the garden center and spending a Saturday morning on your knees in the dirt, replanting the rose bushes that had gotten overgrown while you were busy protecting your life. It's calling Barbara and saying, "Come for dinner Thursday," and actually cooking the meal you love instead of the one that's easiest. Dignity, real dignity, lives in these small reclamations, in the decision to be present in your own life. I had been so focused for so long on surviving that I had forgotten, a little, how to live. And the house, my house, had been waiting for me all along. I washed the windows myself. I fixed the hinge on the back porch door that had been squeaking for 2 years. I bought new curtains for the guest room, the ones I'd always wanted, the pale linen kind that filter light in a way that turns the whole room gold in the morning. I stood in that room and thought about how close I had come to losing all of this. And then I thought, but I didn't. I didn't lose it. I fought for it and I won. There's a version of this story where I would have been too exhausted by the fight to enjoy what I'd reclaimed. I had worried about that. I had worried that by the time it was over, I would feel hollowed out, emptied by the weight of everything I'd had to carry. But that's not what happened. What happened was something almost the opposite. I felt more alive, more present, more myself than I had in years. Because I had proved something to myself that I hadn't known I needed to prove, that I was still capable of fighting for what was mine, that I was still, at 67, very much here. The rose bushes were the last thing. I planted them on a quiet Sunday afternoon, carefully, in the same spots where the originals had been. And as I pressed each root into the soil, I thought about Harold, about what he would have made of all of this. I think he would have laughed. That big, warm, slightly disbelieving laugh he had for situations that were almost too much to be real. And then he would have held my hand and said, "I always knew you had it in you." I cried a little, right there in the garden. But it was the good kind of crying, the kind that means something has been restored. The healing was real, but it wasn't complete, because Derek had eventually called. And what he said, and more importantly, what I said back, was a conversation I had been rehearsing in my heart long before the phone rang. He called on a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after the closing day collapse. I saw his name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to be sure I was ready. Not ready to forgive, not ready to fight, but ready to be completely honest in a way I had never allowed myself to be with him. I picked up. He said, "Mom," just that one word, and I could hear everything in it. The shame, the exhaustion, the grief of someone who has finally arrived at the full picture of what he did. He apologized. He said he was sorry for the nursing home plan, for the real estate calls, for the way he and Renee had talked about me like I was an inconvenience rather than a person. He said he thought he was being practical. He said he hadn't understood the depth of what the house meant. He said the financial pressure they'd been under had made him do something he knew, even then, was wrong. And that in the weeks since the closing, the full weight of what he'd risked, legally and personally, had made it impossible to pretend otherwise. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. And when he finished, there was a long silence, and then I said, "Derek, I believe you're sorry. I do. But I can't unknow what I learned about you." The truth is that an apology, however genuine, doesn't reach backward into the past and undo what was revealed there. He didn't just try to take my house. He revealed the exact terms on which he valued me, or didn't. He revealed what he thought I was capable of understanding and what he thought he could get away with. He revealed that when it came to a conflict between my interests and his, he had made his choice without apparent hesitation. An apology tells me he regrets the outcome. It doesn't tell me that the thought process that led to it has been dismantled. These are very different things. I told him that I loved him. I meant it. I told him that I didn't hate him, that I hadn't, even in the worst moments of all of this, stopped being his mother. But I also told him that the trust, both the legal document and the deeper human kind, was staying exactly as it was. That the house would remain in the Eleanor Sims Living Trust for the rest of my life, and that what happened to it afterward would depend on factors that were now very much in motion and very much within my control. He went quiet when I said that. I think he understood. Self-worth, I've come to believe, is not preserved by pretending that painful things didn't happen. It's preserved by looking at them clearly, naming them precisely, and then deciding how to move forward with your eyes open rather than shut. I didn't need to punish Derek with my bitterness. I needed to protect myself with my clarity. There is a version of family love that is honest enough to say, "You hurt me, I see you, and things will be different now." That's the version I was choosing. Not because he deserved it, because I deserved to live in the truth of what had actually happened between us, without distorting it in either direction. The call ended gently. No dramatic declarations, no ultimatums on his side. He said he hoped I'd let him visit sometime. I said I'd think about it. And after I hung up, I sat for a long moment in the quiet of Harold's yellow kitchen, and I thought about legacies, mine, his, what I was building, what I was choosing to leave behind, and I realized there was one more thing I needed to do. Something that would make the reclaiming complete. I called Patricia on a Thursday morning and told her I needed to amend the estate plan. She wasn't surprised. She told me later that in her experience, clients who go through what I went through almost always arrive at this exact conversation. The one about what legacy actually means and whether the original plan still reflects who they've become. And I had changed. Not in the dramatic, movie-ending way. In the slow, real way that happens when you've been pushed to the edge of something and returned with new information about yourself and the people around you. The changes I made were specific and deliberate. A meaningful portion of what I had previously designated entirely for Derek was redirected. Some of it went to a scholarship fund at the community college where I had once taken a bookkeeping course in my 30s, the kind of education that had quietly shaped my financial independence throughout my life. Some went to Shield and Dignity, the elder rights organization that had helped me when I most needed it. Some went to a land conservation trust that Harold had always cared about. These weren't punitive gestures. They were declarations of who I actually was and what I actually valued. I also tied Derek's remaining inheritance to a specific set of conditions. Not revenge conditions, but real ones. Demonstrated honesty, legal integrity, the absence of any future attempt to control, misrepresent, or financially exploit my estate during my lifetime. Patricia drafted the language carefully. It was not punitive. It was protective. Of me, of my assets, and honestly, of Derek too. Because it gave him a framework for rebuilding trust if he chose to. A map toward something better, if he wanted to walk it. What he did with that was entirely his choice. Karma isn't a bolt of lightning. It's not a dramatic punishment descending from a clear sky. It's the slow, patient accumulation of the choices you make, and the choices made about you. Derek had made choices that revealed his character. Now I was making choices that revealed mine, and I wanted mine to be generous, thoughtful, and grounded in what genuinely mattered to me, rather than in who had disappointed me. Redefining your legacy after a betrayal is one of the most quietly powerful things you can do. It says, "This is still mine, and I'm choosing to make it mean something real." The amended documents were signed on a Friday afternoon. Patricia and I had lunch afterward at a small cafe nearby. Good soup, crusty bread, afternoon light through the window. We talked about travel. She asked if I'd ever been to Portugal. I said I hadn't, but I was already thinking about booking it. And I sat there in the warmth of that ordinary afternoon, thinking about how extraordinary ordinary freedom actually feels when you've had to fight to keep it. The family drama had ended, the reclaiming had been real, and the next chapter was entirely, wonderfully mine. People sometimes ask what it feels like on the other side of something like this, and the honest answer is that it doesn't feel the way I expected. I expected relief, and yes, relief was there. But more than that, what I felt was space. Space to think about what I actually wanted. Space to be interested in things again. Space to be myself in my own life without bracing for a conversation or a phone call or a paper I hadn't consented to sign. Space is underrated, especially when someone has been trying to shrink yours. I started traveling. Small trips at first, a long weekend with Barbara to the coast, a train journey to visit an old college friend I hadn't seen in 15 years. Then a 10-day trip to Portugal, which was everything Patricia had promised. Extraordinary. I walked along the waterfront in Lisbon at dusk with a glass of wine, and I thought, Harold would have loved this. And then I thought, but I love it too, right now, by myself, and that's also completely beautiful. Reclaiming your life is partly about honoring who you shared it with, but it's also about discovering who you are when you're not carrying someone else's emergency. The boundaries I had learned to hold weren't cold. They weren't walls. They were more like the frame around a painting. They defined the shape of things without diminishing the beauty inside. I spoke to Derek occasionally. The conversations were different now. Shorter, more honest, less freighted with things we were both pretending not to know. He was figuring things out, I could see the effort he was making, slowly, imperfectly. I chose to acknowledge it without rushing to reward it. Some things take time. Some trust has to be rebuilt brick by brick, in full view of what was broken. Dignity isn't the absence of pain. It isn't the pretense that betrayal didn't happen, or that the people who hurt you are easily forgiven and absorbed back into your life unchanged. Dignity is the decision to carry the truth of your experience without letting it define the whole of your future. I had been cheated, lied to, backstabbed by my own child. Those are real words for real things that genuinely happened. But I was also a woman who had outsmarted a scheme, rebuilt a home, redirected a legacy, and booked a flight to Lisbon by herself at 67 years old. Both things were equally true. I chose to live from the second one. Here is what I know now that I didn't know before all of this began. Love is not a debt. I did not owe Derek my house because I had raised him. He did not own my future because I had given him my past. Silence is not consent, not mine and not yours. And patience, that long, quiet kind that most people mistake for weakness, is sometimes the most powerful form of preparation there is. I had been patient. I had been prepared. And I had won. Not just the house, but myself. The rose bushes bloomed that spring more fully than they had in years. I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of tea and watched them, and I thought, this is what justice actually looks like. Not a gavel, not a confrontation, just a woman standing in her own home, in her own light, watching something beautiful grow because she refused to let it be taken. So here we are. A woman who was told she no longer had a place in her own story, and who quietly, methodically, without a single dramatic outburst, wrote herself back to the center of it. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what happened to me isn't just my story. It's a story that touches something real in a lot of people. Maybe in you, right now, in ways you haven't fully said out loud yet. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you ever been lied to, cheated, or backstabbed by someone you loved and trusted? Not a stranger, but someone close? Someone family? Have you ever stayed quiet because you were already preparing? Because you knew that patience was your most powerful weapon? I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what this story stirred up for you. Tell me if you've been in a fight like this. Tell me what you did, or what you wish you had done. Your story matters. Your voice belongs in this conversation. And if this video made you think, if it cracked something open or validated something you've been carrying, or simply reminded you that dignity is always worth defending, then please share it. There is someone in your life right now who needs to see this. Someone who has been told, in one way or another, that their home, their voice, or their future is no longer theirs to decide. Show them Eleanor's story. Show them that patience can be preparation. Show them that payback doesn't have to be loud to be real. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because this is what we do here. We go deep. We tell the stories that don't get told on the surface. Stories about family betrayal, about reclaiming self-worth, about the karma that finds you when you do the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting your own life. There's more coming. Stories that will make you think, make you feel, and remind you, every single time, that you are never as powerless as someone else needs you to believe. I'll see you in the next one.